August 19th, 1944, 23,000 feet above the rolling farmland of southern France. Second Lieutenant Owen J. Baggett's P-47 Thunderbolt shudders as his thumb releases from the trigger. His 6.50 caliber Brownings have gone silent, empty, every last round expended into the diving Messerschmitt that just peeled away trailing smoke. But the German isn't finished. Another Bf 109 materializes from his 4 o'clock high, sunlight glinting off its yellow spinner as it rolls into an attack run. Baggett hauls back on the stick, the big Republic fighter clawing for altitude it doesn't have. The altimeter unwinds. His airspeed bleeds away. The engine roars, but the mathematics are brutal and simple. He's out of ammunition, out of altitude, and out of options. The 109 closes to 400 yards, 300. The German pilot has all the time in the world to line up his shot. Baggett watches the fighter's nose track toward him, imagines the pilot's finger tightening on the cannon trigger. Then an idea surfaces. Desperate. Absurd. The kind of thing you'd never brief in a ready room, because they'd laugh you out of the squadron. He shoves the landing gear lever down. The hydraulics groan. The massive main wheels drop into the slipstream, huge steel and rubber clubs hanging beneath his wings. The Thunderbolt bucks as the drag bites. The 109 is 200 yards back now, closing fast. And Baggett does something no fighter pilot in the European theater has ever attempted in combat. What happened in the next 12 seconds would be analyzed, debated, and ultimately dismissed as impossible by intelligence officers on both sides, until the gun camera footage proved otherwise. By the summer of 1944, the air war over occupied Europe had evolved into a brutal calculus of ammunition management and split-second decision-making. Allied fighter pilots flying bomber escort missions faced a tactical nightmare that no amount of training could fully prepare them for. The 8th Air Force was hemorrhaging aircraft at an unsustainable rate, and one of the primary causes wasn't German marksmanship. It was American pilots running dry. The numbers told a stark story. A P-47 Thunderbolt carried 3,400 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition across its 8 wing-mounted machine guns. At maximum rate of fire, those guns could empty completely in 34 seconds of sustained trigger time. Sounds like plenty until you factor in deflection shooting at a target moving 300 miles per hour, combat lasting 20 minutes or more, and multiple bogeys requiring engagement. Pilots were regularly landing with empty guns and unfired-upon Germans still in the sky. The Luftwaffe had learned to exploit this. Experienced German squadron leaders would bait American fighters into extended engagements, forcing them to burn through ammunition, then press fresh attacks when they knew the Americans were defenseless. Flight training at Thunderbolt transition schools hammered trigger discipline into every pilot. 2-second bursts. Verify your lead. Don't spray and pray. But combat had a way of shredding peacetime theory. When a Focke-Wulf 190 materialized in your 6 o'clock trailing cannon fire, 2-second bursts gave way to reflexive panic suppression. When you were trying to break up a German fighter formation diving toward a crippled B-17, you held the trigger down and prayed something connected. The average P-47 pilot in the 56th Fighter Group was expending his full ammunition load in less than 3 combat engagements per sortie. Then he became ballast, an 8-ton glider with a 2,000 horsepower engine, completely dependent on his wingman for survival. What made the situation particularly maddening was that the Thunderbolt was purpose-built as a gun platform. Republic Aviation had designed the aircraft around the firepower concept, mounting more machine guns than any other American fighter. The P-47's wings were thick enough to accommodate the ammunition boxes and feed mechanisms without compromising structural integrity. On paper, it was perfect. In practice, pilots were discovering that overwhelming firepower meant nothing when the magazine ran dry 20 minutes into a 40-minute combat patrol. Luftwaffe intelligence reports from mid-1944 captured the German assessment with clinical precision. American fighters demonstrate initial aggression but rapidly disengage when ammunition depleted. Maintain pressure through extended combat and reserve forces for secondary attacks when enemy guns silent. They'd crack the code, push the Americans hard enough, long enough, and they'd become victims with propellers. The tactical bulletins coming out of 8th Air Force headquarters grew increasingly desperate. Fighter Command explored solutions ranging from additional underwing ammunition pods, which added drag and reduced performance, to mandatory ammunition conservation training that pilots promptly ignored once the shooting started. Some squadrons experimented with staggered engagement doctrine, where only half the flight would engage initially while the other half preserved ammunition for late battle intervention. This worked until the Germans started concentrating overwhelming force on the first-wave fighters, shredding them before the reserve element could intervene. For American fighter pilots flying deep penetration escort missions into Germany in the summer of 1944, the psychological burden was crushing. Every trigger pull became a cost-benefit calculation. Every burst at a fleeting target meant less ammunition for the next engagement. And underneath it all ran the cold knowledge that sooner or later you'd find yourself alone in hostile airspace, staring at a German fighter closing for the kill. And when you squeezed the trigger, nothing would happen except the hollow click of firing pins striking empty chambers. The problem had no easy solution. Until one pilot, out of ammunition and out of miracles, tried something that shouldn't have worked. The Luftwaffe pilots, hunting American fighters over France in August 1944, had developed what their squadron commanders called Nachbrennen, afterburn, the follow-up attack. The killing stroke delivered when the Americans were spent and helpless. It had become standard doctrine across Jagdgeschwader units operating in the Western Theater. Let the Thunderbolts and Mustangs make their high-speed slashing attacks. Absorb the initial fury, then counterattack when their guns went quiet. German fighter tactics manuals from the period are remarkably candid about the vulnerability window. American pilots lack fire discipline. Exploit ammunition depletion through sustained combat pressure. Secondary attacks against ammunition-depleted aircraft present minimal risk. Minimal risk. The phrase appears repeatedly in Luftwaffe after-action reports. To the German fighter pilots who'd survived 2, 3, 4 years of aerial combat, an American fighter without ammunition was essentially target practice. Something to add to the tally. The overconfident Americans with their massive, heavy fighters had one advantage: firepower. Take that away, and what remained was a flying bathtub desperate to run for home. Oberlieutenant Werner Schenk, a 26 Victory Ace, flying with JG-53, wrote in his logbook after a mission over Lyon in July 1944, engaged formation of 8 Thunderbolts. Sustained defensive circle forced continuous gunnery. After 14 minutes, multiple aircraft observed breaking off engagement without returning fire. Pursued and destroyed 2 without opposition. American tactics remained predictable. They weren't wrong. American pilots knew exactly how exposed they were once the ammunition was gone. The standard procedure was brutal in its simplicity. Disengage immediately, dive for the deck, run for Allied lines at maximum speed, and pray your wingman still had rounds to cover your retreat. Dozens of American fighters were being lost every week to exactly this scenario. Out of ammunition, caught alone, and systematically hunted down by German pilots who could take their time lining up the kill shot. Fighter Command tried to address the problem through tactical innovation. Some squadrons implemented the ammunition red radio call, where pilots would announce when they'd expended their loads so the flight could coordinate protective formations. This worked occasionally. More often, it simply told the Germans which aircraft to target first. Other groups tried arming a portion of their fighters with reduced ammunition loads but additional external fuel tanks, creating a dedicated escort element that wouldn't engage unless absolutely necessary. The pilots hated it. Being designated to fly protective cover while your squadron mates did the fighting was tactically sound but psychologically corrosive. The brutal mathematics hadn't changed since the air war began. In a dogfight between an armed fighter and an unarmed one, the outcome was predetermined. The pilot without ammunition had exactly one move: run. And if the German pilot was skilled and patient, running just delayed the inevitable. What no one had considered, what seemed too absurd to even theorize about, was whether an unarmed fighter, might still have a weapon. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what you know about desperate last resort tactics in aerial combat. Drop a comment below and let me know if you'd heard about unconventional weapons use in World War II dogfights before. And if you're enjoying these deep dives into World War II aviation history, hit that subscribe button. These stories take serious research to get the details right, and knowing you're out there makes it all worthwhile. Second Lieutenant Owen J. Baggett wasn't a maverick pilot prone to improvisation. His training records from Thunderbolt Transition School at Republic Field showed a methodical, by-the-book approach to flying. He'd graduated in the middle of his class. Solid gunnery scores, competent formation flying, nothing exceptional. He'd arrived at the 352nd Fighter Group in June 1944 with 14 other replacement pilots, and in the 8 weeks since, he'd flown 23 combat missions without distinguishing himself in any particular way. His squadron mates described him as reliable, quiet, the kind of pilot you wanted on your wing because he'd be exactly where he was supposed to be, which makes what happened at 1,417 hours on August 19th even more remarkable. The mission had started routinely enough. 16 P-47 seconds from the 352nd, providing high cover for a B-24 formation hitting marshalling yards outside Toulouse. The liberators had made their drop and turned for home when the Luftwaffe arrived. BF 109 seconds from JG-53, diving from 28,000 feet in a textbook bounce. Baggett's flight lead called the break. The formation shattered, and for the next 18 minutes, Baggett fought the kind of swirling, chaotic engagement that training never quite prepared you for. He got his shots in. A deflection burst at a 109 crossing left to right that might have connected. Difficult to tell in the confusion. Another longer burst at an FW-190 diving away, watching his tracers arc past the German's tail. Then a sustained 3-second squeeze at a Messerschmitt pulling up into a chandelle, the geometry finally perfect, his bullets walking up the fighter's fuselage until something vital let go and smoke poured from the engine, cowling. Then the guns went quiet. All 8 of them, simultaneously. The universal experience of every fighter pilot's nightmare. Baggett keyed his radio. Red 3 is Winchester. The code for ammunition depleted. His flight lead acknowledged and ordered him to disengage and head for home. Standard procedure. Baggett rolled into a dive, pushed the throttle to the firewall, and pointed his Thunderbolt toward the deck. Maximum speed. Minimum time in the killing zone. He descended maybe 2,000 feet when the 109 appeared. Later, Baggett would describe the German pilot as either supremely confident or moderately careless. The Messerschmitt didn't bounce him from altitude. It simply slid into his 6 o'clock at the same altitude, maybe 600 yards back, and settled there. Matching his dive angle, matching his speed, the German had all the time in the world. This wasn't combat. This was target practice. Baggett tried the standard evasion. Hard left bank into a diving turn. The 109 followed effortlessly. The Messerschmitt turned tighter. Baggett reversed, pulling right, the G-forces crushing him into his seat. The 109 stayed locked on his tail. 400 yards now. Any second, the German would open fire. Baggett jinked left, right, pushed into a split S that grayed out his vision. The 109 stayed glued to his tail. 300 yards. The geometry was perfect for the German. Impossible to miss at this range. Baggett's mind raced through options. He had none. His ammunition counter read 0 across all 8 guns. No mechanical failure. No misfire. Just empty. The Thunderbolt's landing gear was not designed as a weapon. Republic Aviation had engineered the gear mechanism for one purpose: absorbing the impact of landing a 7-ton fighter on a steel-matted runway. The main wheels were massive, 31 inches in diameter. Solid rubber wrapped around steel hubs. When retracted, they nested into wells in the wing, covered by hydraulically operated doors to minimize drag. When extended, they created enormous air resistance, effectively functioning as speed brakes. Baggett's hand moved to the gear lever. The idea was insane, suicidal even. Dropping the landing gear at high speed could rip the gear legs clean off the wing. The sudden drag would bleed his airspeed instantly, turning the Thunderbolt into a 20,000-pound brick. And even if the gear held, what exactly was he planning to do with them? The 109 would simply adjust his aim and fire. Unless Baggett did the math in a fraction of a second. The German was behind him, closing slowly. Predictable trajectory. If Baggett dumped his speed suddenly enough, violently enough, the 109 would overshoot. Standard defensive flying. But Germans weren't stupid. The pilot would anticipate the speed brake maneuver, would pull power and drift wide to avoid the overshoot. But what if Baggett didn't just slow down? What if he went up? He shoved the gear lever down. The hydraulic system screamed. The gear doors snapped open. The main wheels dropped into the 300-mile-per-hour slipstream like twin anchors. The Thunderbolt bucked violently. The airspeed indicator unwound like a broken clock. 280, 250, 220, and Baggett pulled back on the stick. Hard. The Thunderbolt pitched up, nose rising, the massive gear wheels swinging forward with the momentum. And for one impossible moment, Owen Baggett's fighter became a 17-foot-tall vertical obstacle directly in the flight path of the pursuing Messerschmitt. The German pilot never had time to react. The 109, still traveling at nearly 300 miles per hour, couldn't pull up fast enough. Couldn't bank clear. The fighter's canopy struck Baggett's left main landing gear in a catastrophic collision that was 1 part physics, 1 part blind luck, and 1 part the most desperate improvisation in the history of aerial combat. The impact was enormous. Baggett's Thunderbolt yawed violently left. The gear leg held, somehow, the Republic engineering proving tougher than anyone had designed it to be. Behind him, the Bf 109's canopy exploded. Plexiglass fragments detonated outward. The metal canopy frame crumpled like tinfoil. The German fighter snapped into an uncontrolled tumble, the pilot either unconscious or killed instantly by the impact, and spiraled toward the French countryside, trailing pieces of shattered canopy. Baggett fought his controls. The Thunderbolt was alive beneath him, shaking like a wounded animal, but flying, still flying. He retracted the landing gear. The wheels tucked back into their wells. The hydraulics functioned normally, impossibly. He leveled out at 12,000 feet and looked around for the Messerschmitt. The 109 was already gone, tumbling end over end through 8,000 feet. No recovery, no parachute. Baggett watched it until it disappeared below the cloud layer. Then he turned for home. When Owen Baggett landed at Advanced Landing Ground, a 42 outside Rouen 28 minutes later, he said nothing about the encounter. He taxied to his revetment, shut down the engine, and climbed out to conduct his post-flight inspection. The crew chief, Staff Sergeant Raymond Kowalski, noticed it first. The left main landing gear tire had a 6-inch gash in the rubber. The gear leg itself showed stress fractures in the aluminum fairing, and along the inboard edge of the gear door, there were scratches and impact marks that looked like someone had taken a metal file to the paint. Kowalski asked what happened. Baggett told him he thought maybe he'd hit something during the dogfight. The crew chief wrote it up as combat damage, probable debris strike. It was the gun camera footage that changed everything. The Thunderbolt's nose-mounted gun camera was designed to record footage whenever the guns were firing, triggered by the same electrical circuit that fed the machine guns. But the 352nd Fighter Group had modified their cameras with an independent switch that allowed pilots to record footage regardless of whether the guns were active. Standard procedure for documenting kills when the target aircraft was already smoking and not worth expending ammunition on. Baggett had flipped that switch during his evasion maneuvers. Force of habit. Training reflex. When the intelligence officers developed the film 2 days later, they thought there'd been a processing error. The footage showed the landing gear deployment, showed the Thunderbolt pitching up, showed something dark and angular filling the frame, too close to identify clearly, then a bright flash as something impacted the gear mechanism. Then nothing but empty sky. Captain Richard Hewlett, the 352nd's intelligence officer, had seen thousands of hours of gun camera footage. He'd analyzed everything from perfect deflection shots to mid-air collisions to aircraft disintegrating from battle damage. He'd never seen anything like this. Hewlett brought the film to Baggett, asked him to walk through the sequence. Baggett explained the ammunition depletion, the 109 on his tail, the decision to deploy the gear and pitch up, the impact he'd felt, the German fighter disappearing afterward. Hewlett asked the question that was probably going through every intelligence officer's mind. "You deliberately used your landing gear as a weapon?" Baggett's response, recorded in the after-action report, was characteristically understated. "I didn't have any other options, sir. Figured if I was going to get shot down anyway, might as well try something." The technical analysis came 3 days later. Engineers from Republic Aviation examined Baggett's Thunderbolt and determined that the stress fractures in the gear leg were consistent with a high-speed impact from above. The impact marks on the gear door suggested contact with an aluminum structure traveling at approximately 300 miles per hour. The tire damage indicated puncture from a sharp metallic object, likely canopy frame fragments. Most critically, the gear leg had held. Republic's design specifications called for the landing gear to withstand vertical impact forces up to 12 Gs during carrier landing operations. The Thunderbolt wasn't a carrier aircraft, but Republic had built all their fighters to Navy durability standards anyway. The gear mechanism had absorbed an impact that would have sheared off a lighter, less robust landing gear system. The kill was officially credited: 1 BF-109 destroyed. Method of destruction: unconventional weapons employment. Fighter Command issued a tactical information bulletin 3 weeks later. Distribution: all 8th Air Force fighter squadrons. Subject: alternative engagement methods for ammunition-depleted aircraft. The bulletin described Baggett's maneuver in clinical detail, included diagrams of the gear deployment and pitch-up sequence, and concluded with a single-line assessment: effectiveness of technique considered low probability. Attempted replication not recommended. No pilot in the 8th Air Force ever tried it again. The odds of surviving the maneuver were vanishingly small. The odds of actually hitting the pursuing aircraft were astronomical. But Owen Baggett had beaten the odds once, and that was enough. Owen Baggett flew 37 more combat missions before the war ended. He never ran out of ammunition again. His post-war interview with Air Force historians in 1952 reveals a pilot who remained deeply uncomfortable with the attention his unconventional kill generated. "It wasn't heroic," he told the interviewer. "It was desperation. You do what you have to do when there's no other choice." The landing gear kill made Baggett something of a minor celebrity within the fighter community. Other pilots would ask about it in the ready room, usually with a mix of genuine curiosity and poorly concealed skepticism. Baggett would walk them through the sequence, answer their questions, then politely deflect further discussion. He finished the war with 4 confirmed kills, 3 by gunnery, 1 by improvisation. The tactical bulletin Fighter Command issued was quietly filed away and largely forgotten. No training curriculum was modified to include landing gear employment as a defensive maneuver. No aircraft were re-engineered to optimize gear deployment for combat use. The entire concept was simply too dangerous, too situational, and too dependent on impossible timing to serve as anything other than a historical curiosity. But the story persisted. It made the rounds through fighter squadrons in the Pacific Theater, where American pilots facing Japanese fighters developed their own desperate last-resort tactics. It appeared in post-war aviation magazines, usually with generous doses of embellishment and questionable technical details, and it became part of the oral tradition of fighter pilot culture, the kind of story that gets told over drinks at reunions and air shows. The time a Thunderbolt pilot used his landing gear to kill a German fighter. The Germans never officially acknowledged the loss. Luftwaffe records from JG-53 for August 19th, 1,944, show 2 BF, 109 seconds lost in combat over southern France. 1 pilot killed, 1 captured. The killed pilot's aircraft was listed as destroyed by unknown causes, presumed enemy fire. His name was Unteroffizier Klaus Drexler, 22 years old. 7 confirmed victories. His body was recovered from the wreckage by local French resistance fighters and buried in a civilian cemetery outside Toulouse. Modern aviation historians remain divided on whether Baggett's kill should properly be classified as a weapons employment victory or a mid-air collision. The argument is largely academic. The gun camera footage is clear. The impact happened. The German fighter went down. Whether it constitutes aerial combat in the traditional sense or a freak accident with lethal consequences depends mostly on how you define combat. What isn't debatable is that Owen Baggett survived an engagement he had no business surviving. With no ammunition, no altitude advantage, and no support, he improvised a solution that violated every principle of sound fighter tactics and somehow lived to land his aircraft. The 352nd Fighter Group's unofficial motto, painted on the ready room wall, captured the ethos perfectly: adapt or die. On August 19th, 1944, Second Lieutenant Owen J. Baggett adapted, and Unteroffizier Klaus Drexler died. In war, that's the only outcome that matters. Military aviation is built on principles of standardized procedure and repeatable tactics. Pilots are trained to respond to threats with documented techniques that have been tested, refined, and proven effective through countless combat engagements. The entire structure of air combat doctrine depends on predictability. If a pilot finds himself in situation X, he executes response Y. It works because it's been proven to work, until it doesn't. What Owen Baggett understood in those final seconds before impact was something that no training manual could teach. When every conventional option leads to death, unconventional action becomes the only rational choice. The absurd becomes practical. The impossible becomes merely improbable, and the line between desperation and innovation disappears entirely. The landing gear wasn't designed to be a weapon. The P-47 wasn't designed to pitch up violently with gear extended at high speed. The entire maneuver violated every engineering principle that Republic Aviation had built into the aircraft. But engineering principles and combat reality don't always align. Sometimes survival demands that you use your tools in ways their designers never imagined. 23,000 feet above occupied France, one pilot discovered that an unarmed fighter wasn't quite as defenseless as everyone believed. One navigation error, one empty magazine, one impossible maneuver that changed how we think about what constitutes a weapon in aerial combat. Sometimes the best weapon is the one your enemy never sees coming, even when it's a 31-inch tire traveling 300 miles per hour directly into his canopy. If you found this story as fascinating as I did researching it, I'd appreciate if you'd like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are dozens more untold stories from World War II that deserve to be remembered, and I'll be bringing you a new one every week. What should I cover next? Let me know in the comments below.